What types of deception did the Gibeonites use to deceive Joshua? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Joshua on Walking Through the Bible. Today we're going to discuss Joshua 9 verses 1 to 13, but before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to Joshua 9 verse 1, but if you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So Joshua 9, beginning at verse 1. And it came to pass when all the kings who were on this side of the Jordan, in the hills and in the lowland, and in all the coasts of the great sea towards Lebanon, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Canaanite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, and the Jebusite, heard about it, that they gathered together to fight with Joshua and Israel with one accord. But when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they worked craftily, and went and pretended to be ambassadors. And they took old sacks on their donkeys, old wineskins torn and mended, old and patched sandals on their feet, and old garments on themselves, and all the bread of their provision was dry and moldy. And they went to Joshua to the camp at Gilgal, and said to him and to the men of Israel, We have come from a far country. Now therefore make a covenant with us. Then the men of Israel said to the Hivites, Perhaps you dwell among us, so how can we make a covenant with you? But they said to Joshua, We are your servants. And Joshua said to them, Who are you, and where do you come from? So they said to him, From a very far country your servants have come, because of the name of the Lord your God. For we have heard of his fame, and all that he did in Egypt, and all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites, who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon, king of Heshbon, and Og, king of Bashan, who was at Ashtaroth. Therefore our elders and our inhabitants of our country spoke to us, saying, Take provisions with you for the journey, and go meet them, and say to them, We are your servants. Now therefore make a covenant with us. This bread of ours we took hot for our provision from our houses on the day we departed to come to you. But now look, it is dry and moldy. And these wineskins which we filled were new, and see, they are torn. And these our garments, our sandals, have become old because of the very long journey. At the end of the last chapter, we had Israel at Mount Ebal performing the task commanded by Moses in Deuteronomy 27. We noted that to travel from Gilgal, where most of Israel's camp was during the Battle of Ai, to Mount Ebal was about 50 kilometers or 30 miles. Add the rugged terrain and the events that took place there, and it is likely that 2 to 3 weeks have passed. Now it is here that we should note that some people believe that the end of chapter 8 is an interpolation here, and while the event really took place, that it took place at a different time. The reason for this conclusion should be considered, and there are two really good reasons to consider. One, we find Israel back at Gilgal here in chapter 9, and two, because the land between Ai and Mount Ebal, which would include major cities like Shiloh and Shechem, had not yet been conquered. So how would Israel be able to pass through peacefully? For the beginning of chapter 9 says that the kings of the land were preparing for war. To those questions, I offer the following explanations. First, if Israel went from Gilgal to Mount Ebal, why did they return to Gilgal? Notice on our map where Gilgal is. It is pretty central in the original allotment of the Promised Land. It would be strategically placed to either travel north or south, whereas if they were based at Shechem, they would have to travel farther to conquer the south. So Gilgal was a good base, so returning there makes sense. On the second point, remember the state of the Canaanites at this point. They were fearful because God placed fear in their hearts. God wanted them to go to Mount Ebal, and so why would he allow these other cities to attack them along the way? And the answer is that he wouldn't. He would protect Israel. So while it is possible that this event took place later, we shouldn't assume that it did, unless there is other evidence in the text or other texts to show that it did. I thus find no issue placing the events at the end of chapter 8 before the events of chapter 9. What we have here in chapter 9 is a story of deception and self-preservation on the part of the people of Gibeon, and a story of foolishness and a lack of reliance on God on the part of Joshua and the elders of Israel. The people of Gibeon had heard about Jericho and Ai and assumed that eventually they would be next. Now, according to our map, Gibeon is just over 35 kilometers, or about 20 miles, from where Israel was, so for them to hear about Jericho and Ai would be natural. So instead of telling Israel who they were, they pretended to be ambassadors from a very far country. In order for them to pull off this deception, they took old sacks on their donkeys, they took old wineskins and mended them, wore patched sandals on their feet, as well as old garments. They even went so far as to take dry and moldy bread with them. All of this to make it look like they had traveled a long way. When they came to Gilgal, they sought to make a covenant with Israel. Now the elders of Israel thought something could be fishy, so they had to inquire whether these men dwelt among them in the land of Canaan. So Joshua asked them where they were from. Note, they did not say where they were from, simply that they were from a faraway country, a country that had heard of the fame of God from what he did in Egypt and to the Amorite kings east of the Jordan. Seeing what God had done to these kings prompted the elders of their country to send these men to Joshua in order to make a peace covenant with Israel. Now this sidestep here by the Gibeonites should have set off alarm bells, but it didn't because of what the Gibeonites said next, which was to show them their proof that they had traveled from afar. They said that their bread was hot when they left, now it was moldy. Their wineskins were new and full when they left, now they were torn and empty. Even their clothes show signs of long travel. And while all of these things could suggest a long journey, there could also be another explanation for all of these things. Nobody thought to ask why this far-off country thought they needed a peace covenant with Israel at that moment, for Israel knew that their primary task at the moment was to conquer Canaan, not to go off to a far-off country and conquer there. They could have simply sent these men away saying their task at the moment was conquering Canaan, and so any far-off country needed not to be worried. And of course, if the men of Gibeon protested or insisted, then Israel would know something was up. But Israel also didn't do something else, something that had they done would have prevented them from being deceived. What was that? We'll discuss this, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Joshua chapter 9, verses 14 to 27, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time.
Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.